The 1950s was a period of cultural change, deep racial tensions, and widespread government intervention at the aim of equality for all. We have decided to look at specifically desegregation among high schools and the effects it had on a society. Our group argues that the Supreme Court decision didn't solve all the problems it was intended to solve, and that we still see these problems in contemporary America as a result of the Brown versus Board education decision in 1954. Prior to Brown versus Board, the entire South, including Kentucky, required blacks and whites to attend separate schools. This was the equal thinking established in 1896 by the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, in which state laws requiring racial segregation in public facilities was upheld constitutionally. This graph shows that everything in red required educational segregation, which contained the entire South. You see that there is a sharp contrast with the North, which is in green, symbolizing that segregation was forbidden.
In 1954, the landmark decision by the Supreme Court demanded an end to state-sponsored segregation by ending the separate but equal doctrine. The Supreme Court embarked on a major civil rights movement that aimed at equality for all races in the United States. Brown versus the Board of Education of the city of Topeka, Kansas, provoked a national outcry for equal rights. We see in this newsreel the different major headlines that ran across the U.S. on the day of May 17, 1954. High Court banned school segregation. 9-0 decision grant time to comply. Segregation declared unconstitutional, etc. This decision truly changed history and had great intentions for widespread equality. Yet because of regional cultural differences, Brown versus the Board was not taken without a fight.
Although Brown versus Board desegregated schools nationwide, public school systems in Kentucky had their own thoughts on desegregation and resisted many years afterwards. In fact, the first true attempt at desegregation in Kentucky that our group could find occurred in Sturgis, Kentucky on Tuesday, September 4, 1956. On this day, 10 black students attempted to attend the white high school in Sturgis, but were turned back by a violent mob. The next day, on September 5th, the National Guard was sent in to assist the black students in coming to school. This was just one example of the resistance Kentucky schools exhibited during the 1950s.
The resistance to Brown versus Board and desegregation was so heartfelt that Dr. King and Jackie Robinson actually traveled to the Capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky, 10 years after the Brown versus Board decision in 1964. Dr. King and supporters demanded an end to segregation in schools and other public facilities as well. I think this picture illustrates that although the 1950s was intended to be a time of drastic change, the state of Kentucky and the rest of the South intended to preserve their traditions and resist desegregation and certainly the monumental Brown versus Board decision.
I was living in Spencer County, a little town called Elk Creek. In 1950, I would have been 12 years old.
What about you, Mama?
We were in Louisville in Jefferson County for about 2 years. I went to school there.
Their names were Ernest Todd and family, but they did not attend our school. They had their own little one-room school.
And you had two.
And we also had a two-room school. Yes.
And when would you all say that, well, you first started hearing that they were desegregating, that blacks and whites were finally going to the same school?
Not knowing for sure, but I would guess in the very late 50s, maybe 59, maybe 60, right in there.
What do you think, Mama?
Well, of course, we were in Louisville for 2 years, and then when we moved back, we moved to Chaplin, and there just wasn't any blacks there.
Okay.
So, and there wasn't any in school, so never heard of segregating.
You know,
And that just
most
happened.
people, yeah. That's
Not around here. And like I
What?
said, the blacks didn't want it.
Mm-hmm.
They had their own private school.
And
the
they,
whites started going, they didn't like that. It was their school.
yeah. Do you think that was just because of the way, I guess, we were just taught back then?
Well, this
Both
is
of
a
the
little
sides?
community.
Mm-hmm.
This is community what?
That's-
900?
That's just the way it was. I mean, that's what they accepted to be. That's what they wanted to do.
And they had their own private news school.
Mm-hmm.
Why would they want them?
Like us, we had a little private school at Elk Creek, but it was just a 2-room, but it went 1 through 6. We put 6 different grades in 2 rooms.
Well, that was of course, even in Bloomfield, I mean, the blacks didn't have a high school.
Mm-hmm.
They had to bus them to Bardstown for their high school. Of course, they had their own private black school in Bloomfield, great school, but they didn't have high school. And then when they started segregating in Louisville, that's when they started busing, because the West End schools weren't up to par with the East End schools.
And would you say this was early 60s? Late 50s?
Our late 60s, I don't even think it was, I think it was middle 60s, maybe late 60s when they started the busing.
And it could have even been later than that.
Right.
It could have been in the 70s is when they started the busing.
It was mentioned. Not in school. You might hear, on,
Or you hear a kid or something say something.
or
not a
your
teacher.
parents say something's going to happen.
The landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision ended the period of segregation in high schools and is considered a major event in the civil rights movement. 50 years later, segregation still lingers in America. Several interviewed students who attended desegregated schools found it difficult to continue friendships with individuals of other races outside their integrated high school experiences and noted that their lives today are largely segregated along racial lines. Researchers estimate that desegregation caused about a 10% increase in future incomes for Southern-born African Americans. This increase is hardly enough to make a significant change, and in cities such as Louisville, Kentucky, racial segregation still exists along neighborhood lines. According to census data, the areas of Louisville that house the lowest income homes are corresponding to the areas that have the highest percentage of African Americans living in them. This flowchart indicates that fixing the issue of segregation in public schools is just the beginning of the solution to the complicated issue of racial segregation in America. Economic segregation and racial boundaries are prevalent in the vast majority of America's major cities. Brown versus Board of Education was a major victory for the civil rights movement. However, the true issue of eradicating segregation from the United States was far from over, and economic racial segregation remains a major issue in race relations today.